I'd like to welcome all of you to this seminar on Pakistan Challenges and Aspirations, Taking Stock. I'd like to welcome our speakers at the head table, Ambassador Jamshed Makar, Ambassador Najmuddin Sheikh, Mr. Kamal Asghar, Mr. Moin Afzal, and all our other distinguished speakers and OICCI members. Thank you very much for being here, and a welcome to the young IBA students who are also in the audience. On behalf of the OICCI, I have great pleasure in welcoming you to this full-day seminar organized by OICCI. Established in 1860, OICCI has the distinction of being the oldest chamber of commerce and industry in South Asia and one of the oldest in Asia. It's a premier body of top multinationals in the country. With 183 members, OICCI acts as a liaison between member companies and government authorities. Our members contribute about 29% towards the GNP of the country, 22% of the total tax revenue, and provide direct employment to 150,000 people and spend 1 billion rupees a year on corporate social projects. This year, our members spent 1.8 billion rupees on flood-affected victims. Out of the current top 25 companies listed in the Karachi Stock Exchange, 13 are OICCI members. OICCI's primary function is to foster a conducive, open and equitable business environment in Pakistan while facilitating the transfer of best global practices in the country. At OICCI, we combine the expertise, entrepreneurial, managerial and business acumen of all our members. And OICCI is a strong repository for business intelligence. We act as a catalyst in developing trade, commerce, industry and spearheading the promotion of a conducive environment in the country. We are of course very concerned with the various issues that influence the social economic development of Pakistan, and we believe that OICCI must play a role in examining these issues and proposing solutions. Our objective in organizing this seminar of leading intellectual and economic thinkers is to push the debate on basic economic policies, on the fiscal deficit, the state of education, the energy crisis, widening of the tax net and documentation of the economy to a consensus. We need to raise awareness through proactive advocacy and an outreach campaign via the media to the civil society. We work closely with the government on policy issues by providing advice, information and feedback from the leading corporations, international corporations on developing a policy framework for for expanding business opportunities for both existing and potential investors. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers here for taking the time out to be with us here today. I would also like to thank OICCI members, students from leading business schools of Karachi, representatives of other chambers such as the Federation of Pakistan Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Pakistan Business Council, the American Business Council, the American Business Forum, and the media for their presence and participation here today. We hope that as a result of this seminar, we will develop recommendations to be presented to the government by the end of the day. And we are confident that we will be able to do so given the huge experience, expertise and insight of our distinguished speakers. We hope that this seminar will generate a debate on the micro and macro issues being faced by the country. I am confident that together we can meet Pakistan's challenges and come out stronger. Pakistan has to confront and navigate multiple challenges, but it has potential and promise. To quote Maliha Lodhi, Pakistan has an able pool of professionals and technically trained people, a hard-working labor force, a growing middle class of almost 30 million, an enterprising business community, an energetic and free media and judiciary, and a lively arts, literature and music scene. Thank you again for your presence here today, and I would especially like to thank Mr. Moin Afzal for his tremendous support in helping me and the OICCI in organizing this important seminar. Thank you, Mr. Moin Afzal. And now may I invite you to say a few words. Assalamu alaikum.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amina certainly started with a bang, literally. Thank you very much, Amina, for asking to say a few words. Amina actually asked me a few weeks ago whether I could help her in putting together a seminar of the sort we are doing today. And the main objectives were to analyze the investment environment in Pakistan, particularly from the viewpoint of the foreign investor, and then to propose or prepare a set of recommendations for the chamber to present to key members of the government. And my suggestion was that rather than getting people to, in a sense, give recommendations, it would be a very good idea if we could have an interactive day in the form of a sort of dialogue. And therefore, what we've done is to sort of divide the sectors or the sessions into two halves. One where we will get some issues identified by key speakers, and then the remaining half of each session will be for participants, members of the OICCI, to raise questions and to interact. We have three broad areas. The first is the external environment from the viewpoint both of foreign assistance and security. In particular, we hope that the speakers will be able to look at Pakistan's relationship with the USA, the NATO powers, as well as the immediate neighborhood, especially Afghanistan, and all that goes with that. The second session, we will be looking at certain key areas, key sectors. Energy is obviously key, very relevant today. Education, health, and we did want actually Jahangir Tareen here to speak on agriculture. Unfortunately, he could not be here. So we are hoping that in perhaps the second session, Dr. Akmal, who will be speaking on the macroeconomic side, can also raise some issues relating to agriculture. The third session will be the macroeconomic one, with reference both to multilateral, bilateral assistance, and we're very happy that Paul Ross is here from the IMF to update us on what's happening in Washington. No doubt he received a report this morning from there. And we'll be looking at the bilateral assistance areas also. Gareth Aiken is here, who formerly served with the British High Commission in Islamabad and is now with the Asia Foundation. We have actually some very experienced individuals with years of experience to talk to us, and we are requesting them to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and in a very informal session, as I've said, to raise the issues. And of course, you, the audience, are very much a part of today's seminar, and we hope that the short report we will prepare after this will reflect not only the views of the speakers but of the audience. We also have with us a rapporteur, a very distinguished rapporteur, and Mr. Kamal Asfar, who has lost his voice, which is just appropriate because today his job is to listen and record and report. So we are looking forward to a very exciting and stimulating day. It will be my duty, along with Amina, to see that we keep within the time limit, and the speakers will have the option either to come here or to speak from where they are. Finally, I must thank actually personally also all the speakers who have really volunteered to be here today. They're all busy people in their own way. Mona is here, and we're very happy that she will bring a lot of experience in education. So we're very happy that they are here, and very happy also to know that some of the important members of the chamber are here. So I'll stop here, and with this request our first speaker, who needs very little introduction. You've got all the CVs there, but you know, Mr. Najmuddin Sheikh, has been a very distinguished diplomat, ambassador in Washington and a number of other places, and at the moment is involved with the Institute of Regional Studies, is is writing at length, and we hear him fairly often on the TV on key issues. So over to Mr. Mehzuddin Sheikh.
Thank you. If I may take advantage of the offer and stay here rather than. Thank you, Amina. Thank you, Moin, for inviting me to participate. I'd like to pretend that I'm very busy, but I'm not really. I've been leading a retired life for the last 13 years, and the occasional foray into public speaking such as this one is a very welcome opportunity rather than something that distracts me from other more meaningful occupations. So I'm very happy to be here, and I like what we are trying to do here. And I just thought that I'd start with something that struck me, that if we are looking at taking stock of what the situation is, what the challenges are. One of the challenges is that our real problem in terms of security is internal, not external. And if we start from that premise, then we look at the neighborhood rather differently than we have been inclined to do. I keep saying to people that, look, let us at this point give foreign policy a rest and focus on what we need to do internally. When we have done what we need to do internally, things will much more easily fall in place in terms of our external environment. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen, and for the last 63 years of our existence, the first 30 years were really a threat perception flowing from India and our preoccupation with that particular threat, and the next 32 years were Afghanistan first, India second, but both again becoming very important facets of foreign policy and impinging very directly on our internal situation. So as we look at Afghanistan, let me try and talk about where the situation rests now in Afghanistan. It is unfortunately still a grim situation. Prime Minister Gilani's visit yesterday was a good omen, but I don't think that it has brought the prospects of peace any closer. I don't think that the Taliban are yet ready to talk. They still believe that there is much to be gained by saying that the NATO has the watches, we have the time. So I think that is the situation we have. And in the meanwhile, the ethnic divides between Afghanistan are not only continuing but are widening by my reckoning. Right now you have an armed force which is 160,000 strong, an army which is 160,000 strong, going to become 170 by October, and perhaps 240,000 before the NATO withdrawal in 2014. And there is also the prospect of a police force of 160,000, so a total security force of 400,000, which causes concerns in Pakistan. And I understand that our Prime Minister raised this question during the visit and said maybe the army should be kept to only 100,000. But I'm trying to paint the picture of where Afghanistan is going, that if eventually even there is peace of some sort, the ethnic divides are cured, we will have an army that cannot be sustained by the Afghans, and therefore will require assistance to the level of $5 billion a year from some source or the other. Karzai has already told the Americans that I will need this assistance till 2026, and the Americans are right now negotiating base agreements or beginning to commence negotiations on maintaining bases, and my reckoning they're going to have at least 3 bases there. But from Pakistan's perspective, Pakistan has to be clear as to what it wants in Afghanistan, and I don't think we have that clarity yet. When we do have that clarity, I think we will try and see that there are Taliban, there are the moderate Pakhtuns, there are the Tajiks, there are the Hazaras, and these are the and the Uzbeks. All these ethnic groups will have to be accommodated in some shape or form. If this does not happen, then the situation in Afghanistan will continue to remain very fraught, and the consequences for Pakistan will continue to be very difficult. Even now, if Pakistan has clarity on this, we will be able, I hope, to help Karzai, help the NATO forces to get those who are in Pakistan back into Afghanistan and back into positions where they feel that they have a degree of security and where they have a share of power that is what they deserve. Whether Afghanistan has a centralized government or a decentralized government, certainly a decentralized one would be preferable given the situation in Afghanistan. But if they choose not to go that way, that is for them to decide. And for us, the best option would be that we can get those who are here out. I don't think we have ever computed the costs of Afghanistan to us. Perhaps later in the question and answer, I'll try and address that particular facet. But if Afghanistan becomes peaceful, the economic benefits are enormous. Gwadar suddenly becomes viable, which it is not now. It was a port that should have been built only after peace had come to Afghanistan. But even now, it is not too late. No alternate routes have been found by the Central Asian states. No, and there is enough fossil fuel resources in Central Asia for them to be able to meet the requirements of South Asia, and even then to use Gwadar for exporting it to East Asia. They have that sort of potential. There is a potential for increasing or setting up free trade zones and economic zones in Central Asia, and they would welcome, at least they were welcoming 10 years ago, they were welcoming that sort of assistance from Pakistan. Even today, I think if the situation in Afghanistan improves, Pakistan would find very welcome, a warm welcome for any enterprises that they chose to set up in Central Asia. So peace in Afghanistan will mean opening this route, but it will also mean, my calculation, if the Turkmenistan pipeline comes into being, Afghanistan's GDP in terms of the transit fee and the utilization of the gas should increase by 3 to 4%. Ours should go up by about 1 to 1.5%. These are the sort of figures that emerge from just Turkmenistan gas coming into Pakistan and going on to India. The volumes involved would add that sort of figure to our revenues. And of course, there are the add-ons, all the add-ons that come from such an enterprise in all along the pipeline route. There is the fact that Gwadar will develop, and there is the fact that then the entire region can come closer together, because once you open a pipeline, it becomes very difficult to say that no other transit will be permitted. Then you will have Indian goods going across Pakistan to the Middle East and onwards to Europe, going on to Central Asia and vice versa. So that is when Pakistan's strategic location, of which we speak so much, will become a reality. Currently, it's just talk, but then it will become a reality. In turning a little bit eastward, because I think Muin is keeping a close watch on his watch. I think turning to India, I think at this time we can sort of heave a sigh of relief. Nothing is happening with India in terms of resolving problems, but the level of tension has dropped. Dropped in part because perhaps Prime Minister Manmohan Singh genuinely expressed his genuine desire that if there's one thing that I can achieve during my term, a good neighborly relationship with Pakistan, then I will have done it. I never mind asking me about 5 things that I could do. I just want to do this one thing. And that may very well be a genuine desire. It's a desire that has been expressed before by Prime Minister Vajpayee also, but somehow it has never been brought to fruition. We got off to a good start when the talks were resumed, but and when the Interior Secretaries met, I think some advance was made towards resolving the problem, the major problem that India has raised with regard to Mumbai. Some progress was made with regard to Samjhauta Express, which is what we had raised. Sorry. But I think that right now temperatures are low. I still don't see the will in India to start resolving or signing agreements on Siachen or on Sir Creek, which can be done, and which in my view would be game changers. They would change the atmosphere between the two countries and enable us to move forward much faster. But I don't see the will right now in India. Perhaps if Prime Minister Manmohan Singh presses harder, perhaps this will come about. In which case, I think expansion of trade will be much greater than I anticipate at this time when the Commerce Secretaries meet. I think we will just make some additions to the restricted list of items that can be traded. But for really going to total open trade and being able to get rid of all the non-tariff barriers that India imposes and giving India most favored nation in our case will become possible only if that game-changing things occur. And of course, I think we need to think hard about whether or not we are going to resume the back-channel discussions on Kashmir, and if we do, in which direction are they likely to move? Are we going to resume, or are we going to start afresh? I think good sense would dictate that we resume rather than start afresh, and then with just this caveat that nothing is done till the Kashmiri people have said that they find it acceptable. So this is where we rest with them. The most difficult relationship, I think, flowing from Afghanistan is, of course, our relationship with the United States, and by extension with, and I don't mean to be derogatory towards our NATO partners and the EU particularly, which have in many ways taken positions more sympathetic than the Americans in certain respects. But in terms of the overall relationship, the West deals with us in terms of what the Americans say. I think we've entered into a very difficult phase. We've, I think, cultivated a degree of anti-Americanism in Pakistan that I don't think has had any parallel in these 64 years. And this is ironic, because this is the one time in these 64 years when we have a genuine commonality of interest. Previously, they said anti-communist, we said, anti-communist zarur, so long as we get what we need to defend ourselves against India. Afghanistan, first time, revenge on Vietnam, our concern that from Afghanistan, the march to the Arabian Sea would take up our Balochistan province, and our own, at that time, concern with Islamization and therefore using Afghanistan or the jihad in Afghanistan as a tool for promoting Islamization in Pakistan. That was a decision that we made domestically. The Americans were prepared to go along with anything so long as they had their revenge insofar as the Soviets were concerned. I don't think they anticipated, or we anticipated, that this would mean the collapse of the Soviet Union, but certainly that was the motivation they had. This time, the motivation is the same. The motivation is common to both countries. They want a stable Pakistan in which extremism is reduced, no safe havens exist for terrorists, because they believe that this can be a danger to them, not because of any particular love for Pakistan, but because that is how they perceive the present situation in Pakistan. And for us, our declared policy is exactly the same, that we would like to eliminate terrorism and extremism from our country. So we have a common goal, and yet we seem to be seen at totally cross purposes here, and that we hear stories about drone attacks on the one hand and nuclear arsenal being under scrutiny and under possible takeover. Yet the fact is that the nuclear arsenal and its safety features were built in by assistance from the United States, who spent about $100 million to help us to create security and safety standards which are now comparable to or better than some of the declared nuclear weapon states. And they are quite confident that these work. I think they are also confident that Pakistan has created this nuclear deterrent for South Asia alone, and that it does not therefore pose a threat, despite A.Q. Khan and despite the proliferation that took place at that time. I think their interest would be that Pakistan be stable enough so that it does not feel the need to do like the DPRK, sell its technology or its advanced weaponry in order to collect foreign exchange or some funding. But that is my interpretation of American intentions. It may be different. Again, with regard to the drones, I am not sure that we have ever quite told the truth about the drones, and as a result, we've gotten ourselves entangled in a situation where WikiLeaks appears saying that our leaders have said that you keep doing, carrying out the drone attacks, and we will keep saying that this is a bad thing, and we'll proceed on that basis. So we've allowed a great deal of anti-Americanism to develop. Sometimes we do change this, because one of the commanders in the field gave details of what the drone attacks had done and said that in fact they are very effective and they create minimum number of civilian casualties. But now it has become a big issue. Imran Khan is going to have a demonstration in Peshawar, two-day demonstration in Peshawar, and I think lots of political parties are going to join him. So I don't know what direction this is going to take, because one thing it seems to me is certain, that from the American perspective, they may remind you that after all, you asked, and we took out Baitullah Masood in August 2009, and he was TTP. But for us, this is one of the most effective weapons we have against people who are operating from your tribal areas. I don't know whether this is true even, because frankly, they spend $1 million on each Hellfire missile. And in the calculation that they've done in the last 8 months, they've got 2 high-value targets. The rest of the people are low-level militants that have been killed. So I'm not sure as to whether the purpose that this should serve is really being served. But whether it is doing damage is another matter. And I don't think that it is doing damage. But right now we have a situation where I think the relationship with the United States is going to be teetering on the edge. I don't know what information you got from Washington, but one of the things that I saw this morning was that we had part of the strategic dialogue, and $310 million were committed for one program and $190 million were committed for another. So I think both things are proceeding in tandem. Anti-Americanism at a height, and disbursements from the 1.5 billion Kerry Lugar bill side by side. I don't know where we are going to go, and whether we are going to have the courage to be able to recognize where our interests lie, and then to be able to explain these to the people, because I've always said that leadership must always be responsive to the public mood, but it must also be responsible for molding the public mood. I'm not sure that we've done that successfully, either in the civilian or in the military sector. I'll stop there and let you.
Thank you very much, sir. For the benefit of Akmal, who was a little late, Dr. Saab, we are keeping a very informal format, and of course after you've all spoken there will be a dialogue and participation by all the members present. We'd be requesting you in this session to focus, of course, on the international relations aspect. But I did mention that since we couldn't get Jahangir Tareen, in your second session you could also perhaps focus a bit on agriculture issues. In Dr. Ahmad Hussain, we have one of our very outstanding academics in Pakistan. He is at present a distinguished professor of economics at Beacon House National University, senior fellow at PIDE. You probably have read a number of his articles. He's written a very large number of books on very specialized issues. and especially has been, concerned with economic policy making, poverty, relationships with neighboring countries. Dr. Akmal has always believed, I think, that economic policy making, domestic politics, and international relations are all intertwined. And this is why I think he's a very appropriate person to be speaking to us today. Dr. Saab, you can speak from here, or you've got this very impressive pulpit there, you can go there.
Bully pulpit.
Okay. Thank you, Moin, for your very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, what I thought I would do in this very brief discussion is to first bring out the strategic dimension of India-Pakistan relations, or Pakistan-SAARC relations in general, and then to examine what would be the implications if we turned a new leaf in our economic relationship with India in particular and SAARC countries in general. Now, I've been arguing over the last decade. I still remember that session in Bourbon with South Asian parliamentarians about a decade ago, that there is a seismic shift taking place in the center of gravity of the global economy. For the first time in 200 years, when the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting from the West to this part of the world, China and South Asia. At the trends which were available to us about a decade ago, I had predicted that over the next 30 years, China is likely to become the world's largest economy. And if South Asia put their act together, India together with the other South Asian countries would constitute the second largest economy in the world, possibly. Now this has major implications for the way Pakistan conducts its foreign policy and defines its sort of economic agenda over the next decade. The option is pretty, now of course 10 years have passed since that prediction, and I think is now fairly generally accepted that those high growth rates that existed 10 years ago are being sustained. And it is highly likely that in the next 20-25 years, China will become the world's largest economy, and India, even if it doesn't integrate with South Asia, will probably become the third largest economy in the world. Pakistan's choice is fairly clear. We either remain isolated from our immediate neighbors in economic terms, and remain a basket case with the demonstrated inability to sustain high growth rates. We continue to be afflicted by low savings rates, slow growth rates, very high dependence on foreign loans, which have basically now become, the levels of debt have now become unsustainable in a sense, or to shift on to a completely new trajectory of growth, which could become possible if Pakistan, together with India, I dare say, sincerely implement the SAFTA agreement, which is already in place, the South Asian Free Trade Agreement, and to bring about the necessary ancillary institutional changes within Pakistan, which would sustain us in the direction of regional economic integration. My own sense is that Pakistan's GDP growth, as a result of implementing SAFTA, we could add on about 2 to 2.5 percentage points to our GDP growth. But more importantly, of course, we've grown at 5-6% in the past. So this is not I'm talking about the average growth rates that we've had over the last 35-40 years. we could add on 2 to 2.5 percentage points to a 5% trend growth rate. So we're really talking about a 7.5% growth rate in Pakistan as a result of this regional integration. Now the evidence on what happens when countries start doing free trade is fairly clear. And that is that there are immense gains from trade, in this case with India. But the interesting thing is that the evidence shows that the smaller country gains relatively more than the larger country when they open up for free trade. So clearly there are immense gains to be made for Pakistan simply through trade. But to make trade something other than trade diversion, normally you see if you don't allow foreign investment, then free trade often results in trade diversion, i.e. trade that we're doing with countries other than South Asia would be diverted into South Asia once free trade begins. But to have a net increase in trade, foreign investment, free flow of capital becomes essential. So foreign investment becomes a means of expanding trade in a sense, apart from all its other positive benefits. So clearly implementing SAFTA at some point will also involve opening up to foreign investment with India. And this also could have, I think, a substantial impact on Pakistan's economic condition. Quite apart from this, if you look at the composition of goods being produced in India domestically, one of their comparative advantages is in fact in terms of semi-finished goods, intermediate goods, industrial raw materials, which currently unfortunately they're exporting to China but not Pakistan, and some machine goods, especially lathe machines and so on, electrical engineering goods. Now if Pakistan were to start doing free trade with India, the first thing that will happen is that our incremental capital output ratios will fall. That is through the import of cheaper machines and industrial raw materials, the capital cost of setting up projects in Pakistan will fall, which means that for given rates of investment, we'll be able to generate higher rates of growth. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that India also has a huge advantage in some services, not only software but in health and education services. There are already talks taking place between India and China for the export of health and education services. And an implementation of SAFTA would mean that India could come into these two key sectors which are in fact constraining growth. Poor health is, as we know, as we established in our report, the UNDP's Human Development Report, some of the research that I did clearly showed that health is a major economic problem for Pakistan. 73% of the people in Pakistan are sick. And health is a major trigger that pushes people into poverty, ill health. And so relatively cheap health facilities, high quality health facilities can be set up through cooperation with India. And indeed education, and we have much to give on both sides. We have Mona sitting here. We could export educational services to India and vice versa. So I think, and finally, very interestingly in terms of employment, tourism could become a major industry for Pakistan. There's a huge untapped potential of Indians touring Pakistani sites. And with tourism opening up, we'll be putting money into the pockets of everybody from porters to restaurant owners to taxi drivers to hotel owners. So they would have a huge sort of employment effect in a relatively short period of time, and also a stimulant to growth in Pakistan. So in other words, what we're talking about is that given this strategic shift, and it's a historic shift in the center of gravity of the global economy, with India emerging as one of the major economic powerhouses of the world, it makes sense to implement SAFTA, which I thought was a rather wise and far-reaching decision by our earlier government. to implement SAFTA and take advantage of this historic moment in catapulting Pakistan onto a new trajectory of growth. And now, as far as the specifics of SAFTA are concerned, over the last 5 years or so, there is no doubt that SAARC trade has increased quite sharply from around 350 million to over $750 million. But in a sense, it's insignificant if you compare it to the potential for trade. The potential for trade is about 25 billion US dollars. So in that sense, we have a long way to go. And the question that's often asked by economists and policymakers is what, even if countries are willing to go ahead with SAFTA, what constrains the SAFTA agreement from making more rapid progress in terms of trade, volumes of trade? And there, when you look at the small print in the SAFTA agreement, there are two kinds of institutional weaknesses in that agreement, which I think at some point will need to be addressed by South Asian countries. The first is that the agreement on reducing or eliminating formal tariffs, which of course has a time scale, a time schedule for 2014, I think. The problem there is that although there is a timeline, there is no enforcement clause in the agreement, so that if a country fails to reduce its tariffs vis-a-vis other South Asian countries, there are no penalties to be paid. So now, if you, as we know from any sort of institutional analysis, if a set of rules does not have an enforcement mechanism, then it's not really a set of rules. If you can violate those and get away with it, then they don't really constitute rules. So in that sense, I think there has to be an enforcement clause to make sure that the 2014 deadline is met as far as the formal tariffs are concerned. Now, as far as the informal tariffs are concerned, which Ambassador Sheikh pointed out so well, there is another kind of problem with informal tariffs. And unfortunately, most of these informal tariffs have been placed, or non-tariff barriers, if you like, non-tariff barriers have been placed by India for a variety of reasons. And when you look more carefully at these non-tariff barriers, you discover that even if there was zero formal tariffs, 58% of the potential trade in South Asia would be constrained by the existence of non-tariff barriers. So I think it's a very real problem. And the question is, what does SAFTA agreement in its print envisage with respect to overcoming this problem? Maybe at that time when the agreement was drafted, the importance of non-tariff barriers had not been quantified. Well, it certainly has been now. 58% of the trade is going to be constrained. But what needs to be done with the SAFTA agreement to overcome this problem? See, at the moment, there is really no serious provision in the SAFTA agreement itself for eliminating non-tariff barriers. There is a clause which says that there's an experts committee which will report occasionally to the SAARC Secretariat with respect to the specific non-tariff barriers being placed by any one country. But there is neither any timeline for the matter being brought up before the heads of state or even before the ministers, much less an enforcement clause to ensure that within a specific deadline these non-tariff barriers will be removed. So I think the non-tariff barrier issue is still an outstanding issue, and before we begin talking about, and the two countries are hopefully, now that the secretary level talks have begun, will begin to address this issue of non-tariff barriers. But really, to make these talks meaningful, we first have to revise the SAFTA agreement itself to make it tighter and put specific clauses in there, A, for timelines with respect to identification and agreements on the removal of non-tariff barriers, and B, enforcement clauses which ensure that in fact these non-tariff barriers will be removed within the foreseeable future. So that, I think, brings to an end my brief submissions. To conclude, I'll simply say that we really have, as far as Pakistan is concerned, a historic opportunity to move out of our status as a basket case economy, which is grows in short spurts and then goes back to very low rates of growth, which is highly dependent on foreign loans because of its low domestic savings rate, which frequently hits into major balance of payments crises because it cannot export enough. These structural constraints to Pakistan's growth can fairly easily be removed if we integrate with South Asia and become part of a historic new development where the region could well be placed into a position of global economic leadership. I think we need a sort of paradigm shift in our thinking on foreign policy, where we begin to pursue policy not on the basis of ideology, but on the basis of economic interest. And if we were to do that, I think the logical conclusion would be to implement SAFTA as sincerely as possible. And the second thing I think is very important is that once we've made up our minds about SAFTA, then we need to get together and resolve the institutional weaknesses of the agreement itself and make sure that tariffs are removed within the foreseeable future and non-tariff barriers are also eliminated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akmal, for a very refreshing viewpoint on what can be done to accelerate Pakistan's GDP growth rates in the long term. Next and last speaker in this segment is Ambassador Jamshed Makar, who is again well known to everyone in this room, distinguished product of Sadoon School and FC College in Lahore, served with the Navy before partition. From 1965 onwards, for about 30 years, represented Pakistan as ambassador in some of the most important capitals in the world, including, of course, Washington and later in New York and Moscow. Personally, I must say that I first met him during a cricket match in 1951, I think, when I managed to get his autograph because he and Umar Qureshi were then two very distinguished cricket commentators. But then in the late 1980s, I worked as his economic minister in the embassy in Washington and know how deftly and, and in a very patriotic way, he always promoted Pakistan's interests. He's written a number of books, and one of his, of course, very important contributions post-retirement was what he did in East Timor. With that, sir, I'd request you to sort of say a few words.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Moin, for that fulsome, rather embarrassing introduction. I'd forgotten about the autograph that you got in. I don't know if you tried selling it, but it should be fairly valuable by now. I thank you also, Amina, for organizing this very interesting seminar. It's given us, I fully agree with the previous speakers on almost everything that they've said. I don't have any point of contention. And following those very detailed and very foresight, there's a lot of foresight in their speeches. I'm really not much that I can accept second what was said. I'd like to talk a little bit about, of course, our neighbors, India and Afghanistan, because this is where history and geography have put us together. And no matter what, we are going to have to live together and live in conditions of peace, which would also bring about prosperity to our people, which should be which is the role not only of the government but of the people themselves, and is now being played in Pakistan, I think. This brings in the issue of our relationship with the United States. Although it's not geographically been our neighbor, in almost every other aspect, the United States has been our neighbor, been involved in all the major issues, right from the start of like 1951, 1952. We've had a close relationship and often a bumpy relationship. I remember before I went to Washington, a meeting with President Zia, and he said to me that being friends with America is like living on the banks of a great river. Every 4 years, it changes course, and you're either flooded or left high and dry. That was in our relationship with the United States has always been like that. And it also reminds me of a very old movie in which two prisoners from a chain gang escape, but they're still chained together. One of them is black and the other one is white. And they hate each other's guts, but they're stuck together. And, in between their fights, suddenly the people are following them with dogs and things. So they're obliged to stay together. It's not a very good image, but a very powerful one, which I often find ourselves with the United States. And right now, I see it as I think Najmuddin said, relations on a people-to-people basis as well as government basis have never been so trying. And this is a disturbing factor because previously there have been occasions when there's been a certain anti-Americanism. There always is. In fact, all over the world there is. But nobody really loves the guy with the big stick. But our first agreements with them were based on opposite assumptions, which both sides knew. The first arms agreement that we had with the United States, when we found after partition that all we had was old useless Lee Enfield rifles with not enough cartridges, and a highly organized Indian army. And so it was at that time that we did a deal and signed up with the United States. Now, this was an act of what I regard as the principle of foreign policy, that you look to your own interests first. That this was done in the national interest, not so much for anti-communism, because we had a communist party in Pakistan, but it was not, we were not afraid of it, the way the Americans subsequently became, and the aggressive way in which they pursued that anti-communism through people like John Foster Dulles, whom I think Churchill once described as the only bull that carries his china shop around with him. And but that, and we were a part of that, and we got caught in that syndrome, and became a friend of the United States, to the extent that we even provided them with that base at Badagor, to which Khrushchev responded with such ferocity. So our relations with the United States have always been up and down. But as things stand now, I am quite frankly in support of the alliance. I think we need the American support financially, certainly, and we, for the time being, that is a necessity, no matter what anyone else says. But it may not; it's not a good thing because it reduces our ability for development. But I think it's a necessary thing, and if you want, you put your fingers over your nose and take it. But we need it at this point in time. The other aspect of of dealing with the United States is that I found certainly, and I'm sure that Najmuddin found also when they were in Washington, that we need to emphasize our sovereignty, and that there are some things that we will not do, no matter how helpful it may be for us in the long run. And this is always very, very difficult to judge. I think it's the Rochefoucauld who said that in a moment of crisis, the most difficult thing for an honest man is not to do his duty, but to know what it is. Now, here again, when we are faced with the American cutoff, if you like, of the World Bank and things like that, we need to balance these factors. And this game we've been playing with the Americans for 50 years now, and I suppose we'll continue to do. Now, the other thing is Afghanistan and India. On Afghanistan, Najmuddin's given an excellent expose of what the situation is now, and we do need to find a modus vivendi. It's one of the most intractable problems, and Najmuddin has said sufficiently on this to outline the pros and cons. There are pros, of course, but to outline what the problems and what the difficulties are. That we're dealing with a state which initially was the only state to vote against Pakistan's membership to the United Nations. Way back in '50, they had it was the one negative vote in the General Assembly, and so starting from that, things of course got better, and we all know the magnanimity that was shown by Pakistan by absorbing 3 million refugees initially, and then it went up much more. So that problem is there and will continue to remain there. Seems to me our prerequisite is to ensure that whatever negotiations are taking place in Afghanistan, whether they're bilateral or multilateral, Pakistan has to have a seat at the table, because without Pakistan's support and cooperation, no treaty or no agreement in Afghanistan is viable. So let me now turn to the other difficult problem, India. Here, of course, we all know about the background, the difficulties, and the ups and downs that we've had. But I still feel that we ought to persevere. And in this connection, I'd like to refer or quote to you something that George Kennan wrote when he was at the height of the Cold War between the US and the USSR. And this is what he said, that somewhere between the intimacy which we cannot have and the war there is no reason for us to fight, there is a middle ground of peaceful, if somewhat distant, existence on which our relationship could be considerably safer and more pleasant than it is now. I think that we ought to be looking for that middle ground, as has been suggested earlier. There's obviously there's never and I cannot see in my lifetime certainly, but and I wish you all good health. I don't think, but it may not be even in your lifetimes, but it will come one day when we have to work on this middle ground, and perhaps once that is achieved, to build on it further with all the advantages. I saw the strong anti-American sentiment. Today I find in Pakistan not just a tolerance towards India, but a sort of sly look over the wall and say, you know what, why can't we be friends? That attitude is now much more prevalent in the public in Pakistan than before. So it's very important that we seize this opportunity and work on it. But in order to do that, I would say that we need to have our own house in good order, and that is the most important. We need to have our institutions that flourish as they should in a democracy, and not in a false democracy. But we need a strong socio-political structure. No reason why we can't do it. We have done it before. In the early days, Pakistan was, as free as it could be, right up to 1955, and until there came a Cromwellian regime and Mary Pakistan disappeared. But there's no doubt that we can do it, that we have the personnel and we have everything else. Now, one last point, the nuclear issue. This is the kind of ancient mariner with the albatross around his neck, which haunts particularly the West. Well, there's no more East now. Which haunts the West. The Pakistan's nuclear capability puts us in a highly in a club, whether they like it or not. Whether we have a formal membership card or not, there is no question that we have that the nuclear weapon is the one thing which they are concerned about, and they're concerned about it with, as an attitude of, as we say in Gujarati, "Vandrana hath mein astro, bandar ke haath mein astra." Usra. So that is their alarmist view, and that is one of the reasons that we are we are viewed in the international scene that that Pakistan's capabilities need to be taken into consideration. This has also, in a sense, not in a sense, in a clearing, rendered our military options with India, obviously, as in a new dimension, and it is now, in that sense, that balance of terror that exists on both sides. I don't think which is what happened in the Cold War between the Soviet Union. They had this was the one issue that in a way kept the peace. The Western allies, in terms of their ground forces, were very, very small. The Soviets had a huge one. But the fact that both sides possessed nuclear weapons kept in its own horrible way a sense of peace. Now, we need to look into this also when we talk about relations with India, and therefore, is it necessary for us to be spending so much on our military ground forces? Originally, the concept was quite right, that we needed to have a credible defense posture against the Indians. In those days, I always maintained that our budget was not made in Islamabad, in the Ministry of Finance, by experts like Moin Asal. Our budget was made in New Delhi, and we had to do it in terms to maintain the credible deterrent. Now, with the nuclear weapon, I don't see that it being used on the subcontinent. It's there, and so therefore we need to look and see why is it that we have so many tanks and so few schools, or hospitals, or roads, and isn't it time that we change this? Because in the final analysis, the government has secured its main objective, and that is the security of the state. That we are able to. There can now be no question of a threat to the state. So therefore, we ought to, as Najmuddin also suggested, look at our own selves, our own country, and see what we can do to bring it in terms of civil society, in terms of social welfare, in terms of the education and health, and use resources for that, because nobody now is going to attack us in that sense, and nobody dare. This nuclear weapon that we've obtained through all kinds of devices, many of them illegal in terms of other countries, but we did it, and one day we will talk about that later. But it was done. It was, and it has put Pakistan on a different plane, on its own, in terms of other countries, and always at the back of the mind is that these so-and-sos have got the bomb, and it can't be, they can't be fooled around with. So with that thought, and I speak to all our proud possessors of the bomb, that we start thinking of something else and something more, something useful, which can which can help our people who are so underprivileged and have been for so many years. Thank you.
There used to be a public complaint that the budget was prepared in the IMF headquarters, so it's good to know that at least some of it was made in Delhi, sir. Thank you very much, Ambassador Marker, for your words of wisdom and all the ideas that have come up. We have now, ladies and gentlemen, up to 11:45 for request and answer session, so that's plenty of time. You're now free to ask questions. There are a couple of speakers, so if you just raise your hands and a mic will come to you. And please.
Mr. Humayun Reza.
Yeah.
I'm Humayun Bashir. I run IBM operations in Pakistan, also part of the American Business Council and Overseas Chamber. My question is to Ambassador Sheikh, and others have also commented. India is central to the economic development, peace, etc., as part of this strategy with the neighbors. I'm part of the Aman Ki Asha program and delegations that have been to India, and I see tremendous opportunity in the IT sector. The Indians are expanding to Bangladesh, to Egypt, to Philippines because they're running out of people, and they have a plan to do $5 billion of exports from these three countries. And they have plans similar to work with Pakistan to use our resources, and which would create thousands of jobs. And on this path, we can reach a $10 billion export in 10 years and 1 million jobs in the IT sector. But when I returned to Pakistan after these visits, I went to Islamabad. I was very excited, spoke to several federal secretaries, a couple of Minister of States, and they would smile. They would not even want to talk about it. They said, "You are dreaming." The question is the establishment, the intelligence, etc. This is something we cannot even talk about and discuss. So the idea is great, sir, but how do you think the establishment, the intelligence, and others will come around? And when will it come around? In my lifetime?
Well, thank you. I would like to be able to say that no, it's going to happen tomorrow. It isn't. The point is that you have created this particular mindset. Who is going to be able to change that mindset? I talked about the fact that governments have to be responsive to the public mood, but they also have to mold that public mood. Right now, everything that I see emerging is not against, but is not for either. Now, it is the business community, particularly those who see the opportunities, those who, like Dr. Akmal Hussain, have studied it and are able to say that, look, this is what will follow, who will make the difference, and to say it loudly enough to influence public opinion and thereafter to influence. But we are living with a situation in which Ambassador Marker put it very delicately, but the point is that the acquisition of a nuclear deterrent was meant to signal that, look, now we no longer have to maintain 3-to-1 ratios. Now we can go to 10-to-1 ratios. And don't tell me that we need to maintain a high threshold. We don't need to maintain a high threshold. But obviously there are ways in which this needs to be done. And this will be done only when the public is sufficiently aware of what the losses are and what can be gained if another path is taken. Let me also say that the openness that you saw in Delhi is not something that is always reflected in official talks. I mean, it's there are hindrances galore. The 58% influenced by non-tariff barriers is just one element. We have this peculiar love-hate relationship, and there is a degree of bloody-mindedness on the other side that is, of course, when they talk about what we do, they accuse us of exactly the same thing. But it exists, and it's unreasoning. It's totally unreasoning. You know, you show them all the facts and figures and say this is what should happen, and it doesn't happen. I'll give you an illustration. When I talked about Siachen, we agreed 20 years ago that okay, this is it, let's finish with this now. It's been a bother for both sides for long. Your Major General made a mistake going there. You've spent a hell of a lot of money, we've spent a hell of a lot of money. We used to talk about the Indians spending 500 rupees for a chapati, we were spending 100 rupees for a chapati. So it's very good that we supplied a 100 rupee chapati, they supplied a 500 rupee chapati. So we said, let's get out of there. Didn't happen. Now, when Prime Minister Manmohan Singh seeks to press for this, the army says to him, the Indian army says to him that if you now tell us to vacate these posts and then the Indians, Pakistanis occupy it, then don't ask us to take it back. Whereupon, everything stops. Why does it stop? Because, again, there is not enough strength to overcome this sort of constituency position. And I'm thinking of the Indian Army as a constituency. The same situation exists with us, perhaps in spades, because with us, the equation is somewhat different. But you have to, the only way I can, to be able to point out time and again that these are the advantages that can flow. Perhaps we will, it would be very nice, as I said, that there would be a game changer if India was to show more openness, to sign the agreement on Siachen, to sign the agreement on Sirkri, both of which are absolutely cost-free and beneficial to both. Both will save money in Siachen, both will have a maritime boundary drawn up by them rather than being drawn up by the Law of the Sea Commission. So but it's not being done. So I think that we have a share of the responsibility, but I don't think you can absolve the Indians of their share of the responsibility in this. So work on it, and hopefully your counterparts in India will work on it, and we can move forward. Right now in Aman Ki Asha, again let me be slightly bloody-minded also, we give much better coverage to Aman Ki Asha here than it ever gets in India. The Indians are acquiring a particular, which is what needles us much more than anything else. We want to be playing in the same league. We don't want to recognize that we are not in the same league. And the Indians needle us on this particular point. You know, now we're really talking about global issues. You know, we're not concerned with the smaller regional things, and that of course is not the sort of thing that a Pakistani wants to hear. So all these factors play into this. I'm sorry if you'd like to add.
Chevron Pakistan. Let me thanks to all the three distinguished speakers first that you know that with us the key issues related to external environment. I specifically asked Dr. Akmal a question that you spoke about the free trade areas, you know, SAFTA, and one thing which you mentioned very correctly that is that in all those free trade agreements, normally the smaller country is the one who got maximum benefits. But you also spoke, the non-tariff barriers, and you gave us very alarming percentage. That 58%, you know, of the tariffs are still there even with the free trades. I believe, Dr. Hussain, that in case of Pakistan as well, we also have some, you know, non-tariff barriers towards Indian goods. May I ask you, sir, what are the possible reasons? What is it, the political one or something? Why these NTBs are there? And what can we do to eliminate that? If it's political, related to something else, then obviously it would be very, very difficult, to touch that, rather to address those issues first and then to come here. So my request you to please just throw some light on that.
Yeah, just a point of clarification to begin with. The 58% figure refers to the percentage of potential trade that is being obstructed by non-tariff barriers. So that even if you had completely free trade in terms of the formal tariffs, still 58% of the potential trade would be precluded by the existence of non-tariff barriers. Now, just to get a sense of the kinds of non-tariff barriers that exist, there are 3 or 4 very obvious ones. The first is customs clearance, the period of time it takes for a particular transaction to take place between an Indian businessman and a Pakistani businessman. the number of forms that have to be filled, the period of time taken, often, if you have perishable goods being crossing the border, they are severely, a large proportion of that is lost because of the delay in customs clearance. So those procedures have to be harmonized. So that's the first kind of non-tariff barrier. The other kind of non-tariff barrier is with respect to certification of quality. It's very interesting that when you have a transaction taking place between two parties who don't know each other or don't trust each other, then there's a very high cost involved in that transaction if there is no reliable way of establishing what it is that you're paying for. What are the attributes of the good that you're buying, right? So for example, if Pakistan was to buy a lathe machine from India, the buyer would be a little uncertain whether that particular lathe machine actually has the attributes that the seller claims that it has. Now, in order to establish whether or not he's buying a lemon, as they say in our trade, in order to establish that it's a genuine lathe machine with the characteristics that are specified that he's buying, or something that's a lemon, then he has to get some third party expert to certify that this is a genuine machine, right? Now the problem with India and Pakistan is that we don't have an institutionalized mechanism for third party certification of goods that change hands. Now that is a problem that can easily be overcome. We have a large number of, a fair amount of expertise here. The PCSIR is one such organization. And if it was recognized on the other side as being a genuine third party, then this kind of problem can be overcome. The third kind of non-tariff barrier is the difficulties involved in actually transferring the payment. How do you transfer the payment? And for that, an agreement has to take place such that a person can open a letter of credit in the normal kind of fashion with each other's banks. The fourth kind of tariff barrier is with respect to whether those goods have been produced by children or not, or whether certain environmental standards are met. I'll give you the example of a ballpoint pen. If somebody has a ball pen. Well, a ballpoint pen, somebody in Europe, a baby, swallowed the, you pulled the tip out and sort of swallowed the tip and suffocated. So the Western world was able to, after that, was obliged to establish specific safety standards for ballpoint pens, and one of those is that even if a baby was to swallow it, a certain percent, it ought to have a hole in it on the side, whereby a certain amount of oxygen could still come in through the windpipe. Now these are sort of specific examples, but there's a whole range of other safety standards that have been set up. If you're producing pencils, is there lead in the paint or not, that kind of thing. There again, it's very expensive to establish between two parties in an impersonal fashion whether those safety standards have been met or not. And there again, a lot of goods will get rejected by the buyer or the government of the buyer if there are no third-party certifications that these safety standards have been met. And then finally, this whole question of whether the goods have been produced by children or not. If you're exporting carpets, then so these kinds of non-tariff barriers exist, and I think there is no insurmountable obstacle to harmonizing standards and certification procedures between SAARC countries. If we had the will to do so, it's not an impossible thing. Of course, we have done that with respect to our other trading partners. There's no reason why we can't do it here. But unfortunately, as in the case of reduction of tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers have also become a kind of leverage in the hands of those elements within the power structure of both India and Pakistan who want to create subtle obstacles to the opening up of trade. Even when the governments agree, there are subtle obstacles that can be placed. Let me give you an example of this observation. You know, I was part of a small group of 4 or 5 people who happened to attend a seminar on South Asia in Delhi a couple of years ago. And the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh found out that we were there, so he invited us over for a cup of tea. And sitting on his right-hand side was his National Security Advisor. And after he had heard us giving an argument for why a new chapter needs to be opened up between India and Pakistan and why we need free trade and so on, he responded with a wise smile. He said, you know, the gains from trade are immense, but sometimes old attitudes of mistrust and suspicion result in suboptimal solutions. And then he went on to say that I, for one, am willing to open a new chapter with Pakistan, and I'm willing to take up any suggestion that you or anybody else might have for moving in that direction. Then he paused and turned towards his National Security Advisor, and he said, this is my view, and I hope this is also the view of my government. So, you see, there are these problems which Ambassador Sheikh has pointed to, that the power structures which take such major decisions with respect to opening up are not amorphous entities. You know, they themselves have various factions within them with differing agendas. And that is where I think the problem lies. The power structure in both Pakistan and India has to be taken along and convinced that it is in the national interests of both countries to behave in a rational way, economically rational fashion.
Let me just add that in most of the countries, you have to contend with these non-tariff barriers. EU has fisheries standards, everyone has standards. The problem with India is, let's say, cement. I think of cement because cement they needed. Cement the government was prepared to import. And yet, Lucky Cement, whose cement was known to be better than any of the cement produced in India, and had been tested in the Middle East where the Indian buyers had seen the quality, yet it took a month and a half for the institute to clear it. Now, this is what I'm talking. This is what I think Dr. Akmal is referring to as to taking the bureaucracy along, taking along the power structure, that the National Security Advisor will indicate what the government thinks rather than the Prime Minister. So this we have, as I said, I call it bloody mindedness. It exists, and it doesn't exist on one side alone, it exists on both sides, but works, I think, at this particular time, much more to our disadvantage.
My question, or more of an observation, Dr. Hussain, is that India and Pakistan have a very unique relationship, to say the least. But as far as trade is concerned, I have found that the sentiments regarding trade with India are more or less the same in Bangladesh and in Sri Lanka. There is a general suspicion of trade with India. Now, obviously, the relationship, the Bangladesh-India relationship is different, and so is the Sri Lanka-India relationship. And this is, of course, commenting on your comment that the smaller economy benefits more in a trade like that. I don't know if that is truly the case, because most people seem to be fearful of opening up a trade with India. Not just in this country, but in these two countries that I talk of, you know, neighboring countries, neighboring India.
Yeah, as you know, Mrs. Gusuri, both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have in place a bilateral sort of free trade agreement with India. And I was talking to the person who was one of the architects of the Indo-Sri Lanka agreement in the Institute of Policy Studies in Colombo. And he informed me that in fact there's been the increase in the volume of trade has in a short period of time been 3 or 4 times, and that in fact the balance of trade between Sri Lanka and India has shifted in favor of Sri Lanka. As a result of the Indo-Sri Lanka agreement, you see. Now, of course, it's possible in the short term for the reverse to happen between a small and a large country, whereby the smaller country imports a much larger number of goods from the bigger country than it exports to it. Of course, it's possible as a result of the free trade agreement for a number of industries to get wiped out altogether. That a number of industries in the smaller country may turn out to be in fact non-competitive and may lose the domestic market as well, right? But the experience in the post-war period has shown, and there's a huge amount of literature to that effect, is that in the long run, as a result of free trade, the smaller country has to then restructure its economy and concentrate its resources on those industries which are relatively efficient. Now, point is that for the gains of trade to take place, it's not necessary that the small country be more efficient than the big country in absolute terms. So the point is that even if it is more efficient in a relative sense as between two goods, it still makes sense for both countries to do free trade. That's fairly well established. So the point is that in the long run, free trade agreements will result in the restructuring perhaps of both economies, so that only those industries are able to specialize, produce and export which are relatively more efficient. And if you think about it, you know, if you don't do trade with your neighbor or with other countries and support and sustain industries which are internationally inefficient and non-competitive, you are really placing a tax on your consumers, because those industries are going to produce poorer quality goods and more expensive goods and make those available to the consumer compared to a free trade situation where the consumer could get cheaper and better quality goods through trade. So in that sense, not having trade involves the payment of a cost by the citizens of your particular country.
Actually, all the non-tariff barriers has been thrashed out, and both countries know which are the non-tariff barriers existing between the two countries. But unfortunately, very few steps are being taken. But now there is a glimpse of hope, because at Wagah border, both countries are having their laboratories. Otherwise, what was happening, that for to test a cloth, the laboratory was in Ahmedabad, and cloth was being, yarn was being exported from Pakistan to India. So it took about 2.5 months to get the testing back. So these were the actually main things. And then there were some tariffs in each state. They have got different tariffs in each state. That was not mentioned, so I just wanted to mention it that because of that, the price goes up, and that doesn't remain feasible. But efforts are being made. But actually, Aman Ki Asha, I have been in India, I think, 50 times or 60,000 times during last 12 years. But what is happening, that they talk much inside, and that has been proved by a recent report of FICCI, Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce, that they advise their government that they should use water as a weapon against Pakistan. So this is the level of thinking of even Indian businessmen, and they want to have a monopoly here, and they don't want to share the profits, or they don't want to share the thing. And this will only happen only if we allow the international funding from international investment fund. Unless they have their stakes over here, they will not do. The same thing is in Pakistan. At the helm of the affairs, if you find the people, they don't have any stakes in Pakistan. Most of them have the stakes in Pakistan. So this is the crux of the problem. Unless even the big industrialists, the big people, the big politicians, everybody, the big landlords, they have the stakes abroad, not in Pakistan. So people of Pakistan cannot get benefited unless we change this set of mind, unless the investment is made. If you see in early 60s, what happened? Although the industries were growing, but they were investing everything in Pakistan. So Pakistan grew with that during the tenure of Ayub Khan. But now it is not happening. We are only exporting everything what we are earning in terms of money, but we are not reinvesting it here. Still, we have about 60% of youth at present, which we should harness now. If we don't go for that, and we don't give them the channel, we don't give them the place how to move about, I don't think it will.
Hello. So my name is Abdul Majid. I am from a pharmaceutical company, Pfizer. My question is with Dr. Akmal. Sir, I was hearing Dr. Javed Jabbar 5 years back, and he said that after 20 years, the biggest economic power will be China. And you have also said the same thing about 20 years or 30 years because China. We should be hopeful with what we are talking here about the bilateral trade and all these things. But my question is that suppose if all the things remain unchanged, the way we are going isolated in the basket of economy and everything, where do you see Pakistan after 20 years or 30 years down the road?
At the economic level, we are caught in what one can call a unstable growth syndrome. If you look at the pattern of growth in Pakistan historically, we've grown in spurts. High growth during periods when large capital inflows were made available for whatever reason, and then suddenly the gains that we made in the high growth period get lost largely when we hit into a recession, when foreign loans or foreign grants are withdrawn, and we hit into a balance of payment problem and ask the IMF to come in to support our balance of payment situation, and the IMF places contractionary policies. So we have a kind of stop-go pattern of growth. And the result is that mass poverty becomes endemic in this kind of situation. You know, even today, after 60 years of growth, by differing estimates, 33 to 40% of the population is living below the poverty line in calorific terms. 73% of the population is suffering from ill health. The majority of the population doesn't have access to clean drinking water. So in other words, we have a kind of economic apartheid in Pakistan, where a small elite enjoys unprecedented luxury, and the majority of the people are relegated to a life of barbarism. Now this kind of situation is going to persist unless we change our policy paradigm, and we'll discuss the change in policy paradigm, but this kind of situation is likely to persist over the next 20 years, whereby endemic poverty persists, majority of the people deprived of basic services, where we remain aid dependent in order to be able to generate any kind of growth. I feel that this kind of economic apartheid and inability to sustain growth rates is going to place stresses on both society and state if it carries on. Clearly, in order to be able to pull out of this, we have to create a new kind of policy paradigm. Firstly, with respect to our neighbors, you know, instead of having an adversarial relationship with neighbors, we need to have a cooperative relationship with neighbors. But let me sort of, to drive the point home, come up with an even starker fact. You see, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climatic Change has now come out with a 4-volume study called the Fourth Assessment Report on the World's Environment. This report is the greatest scientific undertaking in human history. And what it points out in the South Asian case is that with a 3 to 5 degree centigrade increase in in South Asian temperatures, average temperatures, there will be a 30% decline, in absolute terms in the yields per acre of food crops in South Asia. Now, a 5 degree centigrade increase is now fairly, it's now fairly well established that we're going to have a 4 to 5 degree centigrade increase in temperatures over the next 3 or 4 decades. With a 30% decline in yields, and this estimate has been made with a 99% probability level, so it's a highly significant projection. What we're really talking about are famines in this region, because 30% decline in yields will create such a large food deficit that even if the countries of this region had the foreign exchange to import the grain, world surpluses will not be enough for us to buy that grain. Clearly, now cooperation across the region has become not only a matter of economic welfare, it's a matter of survival. Because what we need to do very quickly now are 4 initiatives which can't be taken without opening up. With India, with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh. The first is that we have to put our heads together and develop heat-resistant varieties of food grain. The second is that we need to have joint watershed management to make sure that we don't run into severe water constraints as a result of this global warming. The third thing we have to do is to build silos, secure silos for food storage in every district in the region to prevent famines taking place in a localized fashion. So unless these measures are taken, we're really risking in a very real way the lives of our people in the future. And that is why I think, quite apart from the economics of the whole argument, which is fairly well established, we need to look at it as an imperative of survival.
Of the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy. I wanted to make an observation that, except for Ambassador Sheikh, I did not hear much said about this internal threat. And no matter what happens to climate change, which is 30 years away,
or China becoming the powerhouse, or India continuing to pester us, I'd love to hear more about this internal threat, because in the long run, as Keynes said, we'll be dead. We have to think about today, and I think we may be falling into a danger of fiddling around with the deck chairs when the Titanic is likely to sink. I'm dramatizing the simile, and I was struck by the fact that this was not mentioned by any speaker in any depth. The second observation is that when we have heard about regional trade, we have heard about India, we heard very little about Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Afghanistan, and the risks of trade with Afghanistan, which we are familiar with, but also Central Asia, and the most important country that was not even mentioned was Iran. We don't have to wait for India to open up our trade. Why are we not doing business with these other countries, especially Iran and Central Asia?
I think perhaps I did talk about the fact that Central Asia, the trade with Central Asia is very dependent on the restoration of stability in Afghanistan, and that I think is the opportunity that we should focus on. not the security questions in Afghanistan. I am one of the advocates of the fact that I really don't care what government there is in Afghanistan, for a very simple reason, that for many, many decades to come, Afghanistan will continue to be largely dependent on Pakistan. We do not need to worry. What we need to see is a stable Afghanistan which has resolved its internal problems sufficiently so that it can become like us. It can take advantage of its strategic location. Now, both of us keep talking about strategic locations and yet are unable to do anything about it. With regard to Iran, I think we have made every effort to try and promote it. Our own internal limitations we don't seem to recognize, and I'm not the expert. I'm sure there are many more, all the businessmen here are much more expert in this. What do you want to export to Iran? It's a question that we should address. What are the commodities we have here which we can export? Textiles. Yeah. And what are the Iranians doing in terms of textiles? They are producing themselves. We talk to them in terms of eco. Let us reduce tariffs. Let us create markets. It didn't happen because right now, this particular organization that we had, the Economic Cooperation Organization, I was rather deeply involved with it because I was there in a sense at the expansion when we included the Central Asian members, and we talked about the fact that one of the things we have to do is reduce tariff barriers, reduce the barriers to easy transport back and forth, and we did not get as far as we should have. The Iranians talked about creating free markets at the border. These are not bad ideas, but these are not ideas that are going to give you volumes that you're looking for. So I think we should think in terms of what we do internally to diversify our export range. We are now, excuse me, I may have the figure wrong, but we are talking about 67% textiles. 60? Okay. And give or take, how much, and after textiles, this is inclusive of raw cotton, or this is textiles and yarn? And, okay, now, all I know is that we have a nice export niche from Gujranwala. Our small electric motors, etc., are finding markets elsewhere. But where is that range? Where is that range? Why, we keep talking about our human resource. What has that human resource developed in terms of indigenous exploitation of what we have? We are largely textile or other commodities of this nature, that is agricultural. So I stand ready to be corrected. But
Asif Juma is my name. Just a comment, well, actually two comments. First of all, I don't think we dwell as much or given as much time to what Ambassador Marker said. We all know what the issues are, but the number one key stumbling block that we have is that the institutions in this country have been contaminated. And because of that institutional contamination, your democracy is fragile. Why do you have these spurts of famine and feast? Because your institutions don't have the ability to sustain development. So I think if we can just think about how do we bring about that institutional change? How do we as participants, as long-term stakeholders in the economy in Pakistan, in the nationhood of Pakistan, what part can we play? So that's point number one. On just a comment on the textiles, the filament yarn industry, for example, in Pakistan, the famine and feast or the fortune or misfortune of that industry is directly linked to how severe the border control at Zaidan is. How much is smuggled across, or is the border crossing closed? So, there are those opportunities, and I agree with Mr. Latha, that I think we need to be looking beyond just India. We're really India-centric right now in more than one way. No, in more than one way, whether it's the military being India-centric, whether it's the businessman being India-centric. India Yes, it's a major opportunity, it's a major player, we can't ignore them, but they are not necessarily the end all and the be all in terms of our own survival and sustainability. Thank you.
Akmal, you want to say something now?
Yeah, I just, first of all, this, I completely agree with you that the institutional framework in Pakistan is the basis of the failure to sustain growth over long periods of time. In fact, that is going to be the burden of my argument in the next session. But returning to Lakha Saab's point, and I think it is an important point, about the Titanic sinking as a result of the internal threat of basically the internal consists of armed militant groups who have emerged as rival centers of power to that of the state within the geographic domain of the state. And this is the Titanic sinking. But the point is that this threat is intimately linked with an economic structure where mass poverty is endemic. And as I mentioned in response to an earlier question, that if we continue to conduct our policies within the present sort of policy paradigm, this mass poverty is going to persist even over the next 2 decades because of the pattern of our growth. So clearly addressing the crisis of terrorism, if you like, has not only a military dimension to it. We've obviously got to fight and establish the rate of the state, but equally importantly, we've got to establish the economic basis of giving a stake in citizenship to all of the people rather than a small elite. And that requires institutional changes that we can talk about in the next session.
Just quick, last final question.
Thank you very much. My name is Rashid Jan Muhammad from Mapak Edible Oils. Small observation and a question as well. I heard Ambassador Sheikh and Dr. Akmal Hussain. You see, after listening to them, we are going back to the same old decades story that we have inconsistent policies in Pakistan and the bureaucratic hurdles. For bureaucracy, I remember one quote, I don't remember who said that. If you want to make a sin, you make a sin against God and you will be forgiven. But if you make a sin against a bureaucrat, then you had it. So you see, what I am trying to, slightly away from what is, I cannot match what they say. I just want to say that, look, they all have been directly or indirectly associated with the various governments, all of them, directly or indirectly. Now, you people have come out of that stage and you are inculcating your experience to probably us, those who are on the receiving end, from the policymakers and the bureaucrats. Taking the opportunity of this forum, I would say, and particularly to our President, that such ideas or such help should be given to those who are at the moment in the power of policy thinking. Forget about the government. We are not talking about the government. So those who are in the policy thinking, those who are in the present bureaucracy, so at least they should learn the experience what you have passed through. Rather it can be done as an institution or it could be done as a proper forum. Unless you do that, we will listen it, we will go out, I will raise a question, but the problem will not be solved. Thank you, sir.
I suppose that was really a comment. Huh? Okay, I think
Took
that
it to heart, but still a comment.
That concludes this session. Before I conclude, I think Amina would like to make a short announcement. And we will reconvene in 15 minutes after a cup of tea.
Actually, we have several members of the OICCI Managing Committee here. Mr. Asif Juma, Mr. Kamal, I think you are here, Kamal Chinoy, Mr. Khalid Rahman, Mr. Humayun Bashir. We also have 2 former presidents, my predecessors, not immediate, Mr. Farooq Rahmatullah and Mr. Kamran Mirza. So, Humayun, may I ask you to give away the OICCI shields to our distinguished speakers, please? Thank you. Coffee is at the back of the room.